of today. We've got 3 sessions today, which are very exciting. It's the second session from Sponsors Account Technologies 2. So I will pass over to the wonderful Isabella, who can kind of give an intro to what the session's about, a bit of background about herself rather than me explaining it very poorly. And then, yeah, we can get started from there. Let us know if you've got any questions in the chat and I'll keep an eye out.
Super, thank you. Hi guys, thanks all for joining. So this is my talk on starting out as a developer. I thought I'd start with a bit about me and how I sort of got into my role as a sort of developer, software engineer. A bit about me. Bella, my pronouns are she, her. And I did maths at uni. So after doing like a lot of mathsy, sciencey based A levels, I decided to do a master's in maths. And then coding wise during that, I pretty much didn't do any for like the first 3 years of the course. And then in the last year of my course, I tried to do a bit for my dissertation, but that was more sort of using Python for like graphs as opposed to sort of like for web development. And so I kind of didn't really have any like experience with that. And then I joined Account Technologies after I graduated in 2019 as a data analyst, which was sort of, you know, everyone else had also done maths degrees. It was, you know, what you would kind of expect sort of a maths graduate to do, you know, spreadsheets, graphs. I learned some SQL whilst I was in that role, and then sort of also did a little bit more Python. And then in early 2020, an opportunity opened up to do a secondment for software engineering for our new ventures team. And it's kind of in the name, but the new ventures team was like looking for sort of new ventures avenues to go down for the company, sort of a new like product, a new direction, like a new sector kind of thing. And I sort of decided to go for it. Didn't really have any idea of like if I really wanted to do software engineering, if I'm honest. I just thought I'd kind of give it a go. I've ended up like really, really loving it and really enjoying it. But I did like have a lot of sort of apprehension of like, didn't really consider myself a coder or someone who was like particularly tech savvy. But I'd done like a lot of sort of learning on the job, and now like sort of a career in tech is definitely sort of what I am doing and pursuing. So now I am a software engineer for New Ventures, and I'm predominantly a back-end developer on our product Tenancy 360. So this is sort of Tenancy 360 is Rita mentioned it in her talk. It's a tenant referencing platform, which we've been building for about a year now. And we've got some customers using it, which is really exciting. But what's really cool is that I feel like I've grown as a developer as sort of the product's grown. So I've sort of learned along it, and hopefully as I'm getting better, like the product's getting better as well, which has been like a really cool way to kind of learn tech and learn coding and learn programming by doing, and sort of realizing that you can add value whilst you're learning. Like you can also be like adding value to a product or a company sort of whilst you're also trying to like figure stuff out basically. So yes, that's a bit about me. And then so what I want this talk to sort of be is taking through sort of things that I have learned sort of as you entered the tech world that aren't necessarily the things that are like directly learning how to code. You know, everyone has different ways that they've got into code. Some people do it at uni, some people do it, do online courses. Some people learn on the job. It's one of those things, but sort of the soft skills of software engineering, as I've called it, is kind of what I want to sort of have a bit of focus on. And so I also want to take a moment to talk about how I've said like developer and like software engineer. I think that there's sometimes some stuff, I've read stuff online about like, you know, there's a certain point when you call yourself a programmer and then a developer and then a software engineer. And people often men like to gatekeep kind of the terms that you can use for like, you know, what you are as a sort of coder. But kind of the reality is that, you know, you can, if you are coding and you're building something and you want to call yourself a software engineer or a software developer or a programmer, you can do that. I mean, obviously jobs have job titles and stuff. And, you know, maybe your employer will be like, you're this, but I am a software engineer because that's what I think I am. And so I think it's kind of a lesson in kind of just being like confident. And if you're doing it, if you're trying to do it, if you're learning code on courses and you're, you know, trying to build APIs and stuff and you're going for jobs, then like you are a developer, that is what you're doing. But that's a little side point. So let's get into the soft skills of software engineering. The first one is time management, and not exactly off the wall, but it is really obviously really important. Sort of the skills of sort of approximating how long a task will take you as well is something that I think is really important, sort of when it comes to like managing tickets or, you know, bug tickets, task tickets that you've got. It's important to sort of know where your skill level is at and then how long you think like a task is going to take you. Obviously there's always unexpected issues that crop up, like when you're working with computers, like package issues and troubleshooting, and like, you know, some of that time also has to be accounted for. And another thing I also find is factoring in pipeline times. So when you're coding something and you finished it, the time that it actually takes for it to then sort of go through a CI/CD pipeline and get online, like, or go live, you know, during that time, like, can you be doing other things? And sort of managing your day-to-day around that is sort of something that like I always like am thinking about during the day. And again, another sort of obvious one, I feel like everyone, every job probably needs time management and problem solving. But I think a big thing, as well as sort of problem solving and critical thinking for software engineering, is like creativity as well. Every feature, every bug that you want to create, like, is a problem that you need to solve. And often I spend more time thinking about how to solve something than actually writing the code. I think there's always so many factors that go into like what is the best solution, and I always like try and think that like the best way might not be the best way, and like the right way aren't always like the same thing. Like sometimes the best way to do something, balancing sort of like the time and the quality of the solution based on like what you can do, means that, you know, it's not necessarily like the sort of the most sort of correct code like quality solution in the world, but it fits that purpose. Like it fits that purpose if you need to like get a quick fix out, or if your product is still in development doing something, you don't want to over engineer what you're working on because you're creating a new product and you need it to be up quickly. The next thing is sort of people skills and emotional intelligence. I think that there's sort of this idea, it's been mentioned in other talks actually, about, you know, this idea of developers like sitting at a desk all day with headphones. And I mean, to be fair, that is literally what I was doing before I started this presentation today. But there's also so much like more than that. When you're working in a tech team, like the reality is it's so much more collaborative. And, you know, you need to sort of be aware of what everyone else is doing and like what their skill level is at, and like where they can help you and where you can help them. Our team is trying to adopt Agile at the moment, and, you know, that involves like lots of stand-ups and meetings and sort of keeping everyone in the loop, and sort of being aware of that and developing that as a skill, I think, you know, is you know, just is also an important skill as much as like, you know, your understanding and ability to code and of tech. And also, you know, having sort of the empathy and thinking about your customers and what the best solutions are for your customers, because, you know, for most products, like you're building something for people to use, so you need to understand what those sort of people want. And, you know, I've found, especially in our product, like, you know, we're serving letting agents and tenants, and they are, you know, someone looking for a property, like what are they, you know, what do they need, who are they, who is going to be using our platform? Is it going to be people, you know, renters who, you know, they need the process to be happening quickly because they want to get into their property? How, you know, a lot of people who rent in this country, you know, are probably from another country, and so making sure that our platform, you know, is coherent and clear for someone who maybe English isn't their first language. All of these things are things that you need to think about, like when you're coding and when you're actually building something. And sort of in a similar vein to that is communication and listening. I saw a tweet, and I really wish that I had saved it so I could like include it in here, but it said something along the lines of coding being a language to tell people what you want the computer to do. It's not just like the ones and zeros to like tell the computer what to do. So you need to sort of effectively communicate. Oh, I've seen Alex has like jumped back on. Is everything okay?
I was going to say I didn't want to interrupt the flow, but we've had a few questions come through, and I thought rather than
that's okay.
Questions at the end, kind of go through a couple now, if that's all right with you, Bella.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I wasn't expecting so many questions, but thanks, guys.
Cool. Exactly, you're obviously engaging people, which is great. But obviously, you kind of mentioned your path to engineering in the first place with data analytics. The first question was, would you say that was an easier route or quicker route than others potentially? So like starting off through data analytics, I guess, and then moving on.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, obviously I can't really sort of speak for the other paths because I don't really know, I only did mine, but I think in terms of like how much I've learned, I think the way that I learn is by doing, and definitely with coding as well. I think that like the best thing for me was to just be dropped in with like, here is like an actual real problem, you know, figure out the solution. And so I think in that kind of stream, I think, yeah, it's been quite like a rapid path to sort of having, you know, a product that I'm looking after has been sort of quite quick. But I think then it's kind of balancing that out with like obviously the depth of knowledge as well that you kind of need. So sort of alongside, I'm trying to like hone my skills and development, and maybe somebody who's done like a more traditional course would have that sort of more solid, but maybe less of the actual applying it to real life situations kind of skills. So I think there's sort of like benefits in both.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was another question kind of around how long it would take to learn a programming language that could kind of like land you a job. And I think I'd be interested to tie that in, I guess, with your experience as well, obviously coming from a maths data background. How long did it then kind of take you to learn languages? And I guess the other side of that is, I suppose it's language dependent as well. But for you with Python, for example, kind of how long did it take you to feel confident and comfortable with that language?
That's a good question. I think my introduction to Python was quite sort of slow and in dribs and drabs. So I'd say I probably have maybe 2 years of sort of doing Python relatively daily under my belt. And I think that, I mean, to be honest, still like now I would say that like I learned like so much about the language. I don't think you ever finish necessarily learning a language. But I think that there is a moment where sort of the penny drops for just being in like a coding sort of mindset. And I think that probably took me maybe like sort of 6 months to a year of like looking at Python files pretty much every day. I mean, I also do a little bit of like JavaScript and HTML and stuff, but Python's sort of my main thing. And I think once you kind of get over that barrier of sort of being in the coding mindset, which is kind of hard to describe, but I think once you get it, you kind of get it. That kind of makes everything, I think, a lot smoother, even though you're still learning like all the time.
Yeah, I think that, I think that makes sense completely. And as I say, it's kind of one of those things that's dependent on the person, it's dependent on the thing, and you're never fully done with it. So yeah, I guess it depends on what stage you feel comfortable in that sense as well. I think one question, and I'll let you get back into the flow. Hopefully I haven't interrupted.
That's absolutely fine. I was kind of going for like maybe checking it at the end of the slide, but I didn't realize there were so many questions.
Well, that's it. I thought, oh, we'll do them at the end, and then they kind of kept coming through. I was like, hang on, I'll wait just in case. But quite a good question actually around, how much of fresh code writing is there, like versus researching, Googling, thinking, using existing templates, etc. Kind of when in your day to day, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely changed so much, like now versus when we were starting. So when we started building Tenancy 360, we had a more senior engineer sort of like get us kind of going, and built sort of the basic kind of framework of our back-end application. And for a long time, like a lot of building on that was writing like a lot of lines of fresh code, and still to an extent now at the moment, like if we want a new feature, there's still like tasks that do require quite a lot of like actual new lines of code. But the actual maintenance of the platform now is definitely, we're always looking for normally the fewest lines of code we can add to solve a problem or to add a feature if possible. One of the things that I'm sort of going to touch on a little bit is kind of coding principles and stuff, and how you don't want to write code because you sort of foresee it. You want to code it because you need it in the moment. And I think that one of the mistakes I made at the beginning is that I was coding for potential use cases of our referencing platform, and then that was just sitting there and not actually doing anything, and there was a waste of time, and really just kind of trying to like almost do the bare minimum of what needed to be done, so as not to like kind of create clutter. And I definitely spend a lot more time trying to sort of research kind of the best way to do something, and then as few lines as possible to actually do it.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll let you get back into it, and hopefully won't interrupt you mid-slide again.
No, it's fine.
I'll keep an eye on the chat, and there are a couple more questions I'll kind of answer and go through, because I think I can kind of send a few links through. But thank you for those like mid-session questions.
No worries. I thought it was because my internet had gone, so I'm just relieved that it was just the questions.
It's not always a bad thing if I just randomly pop up. So yeah, that's all good.
Yeah. No, good. Cool. Thanks, Alex. Cool. Right. Where was I? Let's see what the next thing is. Self-awareness. So sort of this is kind of about knowing your sort of strengths and weaknesses, and knowing when you need to reach out for help. I think, just because you're new to something, and, maybe you don't have like loads and loads of sort of technical skills, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you sort of know when you are and aren't like out of your depth. And then equally knowing when you can also sort of be of help to others. And sort of in that kind of vein, being aware of others, and sort of, being aware of when you are talking to somebody about tech who isn't necessarily super technical. So, often you're talking to, the marketing like section of your team, or, it's something to do with legal or something like that. And you're talking about this product, and, you may know like the sort of technical ins and outs that go into solving their problem that they have, but they don't care about that. So you kind of need to balance that out, and not like, know when to get into the super technical and know when to actually not, in order to sort of, again, communicate effectively like with your colleagues. Being accountable, sort of writing and maintaining and managing your own stuff and taking ownership of it from the get-go is really important. It would be like really great if we all like wrote bugless code, but we just don't. And so making sure that, if you've pushed something and it's gone wrong, sort of being aware of like well, like documenting well, like what you've done, so that when it goes into like working out what the problem is, you can also do that, and sort of taking ownership of that. No one at the beginning is going to, you know, or they shouldn't like berate you for making mistakes at the beginning. The idea is that you know, you're making fewer and fewer mistakes as you go. But I'm pretty sure even like the most senior developers aren't writing absolutely flawless code off of the bat. And, you know, not being sort of like too proud to admit that you make mistakes is, you know, an important part of like learning to code, but also like continuing to and sort of developing and growing as a coder. And then the last one on this slide is very much Googling. And I care about it so much that I've dedicated the rest of the slide to just 3 memes about Googling, because the skill of, it was mentioned on another talk actually of this week, of the skill of like learning to learn, and which is such a good point. And I think that it's quite interesting, or at least I found it interesting, coming from a maths background. Like all of my degree was, you know, about sort of an academic integrity and not plagiarizing, and as it is for most degrees. And, you know, that's obviously completely valid and definitely should be the case. But then there's a slight difference in sort of the open source, like Stack Overflow world, where there's no point in solving a problem that someone has already solved, which as a mathematician who spent most of her degree solving problems that other people had already solved was kind of a bit of a hard thing to take. But it is so true that, you know, you want to be solving the problems that are niche and specific to sort of your product and what you're building or what you're doing. You don't need to sort of be like reinventing the wheel, and also being really comfortable in like not knowing things and being able to figure them out is sort of the skill that's definitely always going to be usable for coding. Like the skill of maybe, you know, your specific set of like knowledge of Python or JavaScript, or a specific framework of one of those 2 things, or anything, you know, might be really great, but in a couple of years something else might be trendy, or some other tech is going to appear and be really useful. And so the skill that you can keep is the skill of figuring those new things out, and literally just Googling. Like the amount of times that I just sort of say to other people, have you tried Googling it? Like, have you Googled it? Have you Googled it? If they ask me, all I'm really doing is Googling it. And that is the skill of like knowing what to search, is kind of the really good skill to sort of develop. And then sort of in a similar vein, are there any like more questions or anything? I feel like Alex is like taking care of it, and you can just interrupt me again, Alex, if there are more.
There was one really good one, just kind of before we hop on to the next one, about tips and recommendations for career changers who are considering going into software engineering, and I guess any things to consider before making the jump, which I suppose there's kind of a decent amount to consider. But as someone who I suppose is within the industry, kind of, is there any tips you would give?
I mean, I would say sort of like logistically of making the jump, like, you know, finding the right opportunity sort of for you that like fits you, and but also like an element of like jumping into the deep end. I think I got like quite lucky in my situation where I was diving into a secondment, and I knew that if it didn't work out, then I was able to sort of go back into being a data analyst. I ended up not doing that. I didn't want, like, by the time I'd sort of spent 6 months doing software engineering, I was like, this is totally for me. But at the beginning, I very much did have like a lot of reservations. And I think that, you know, there is a certain element of sort of just diving into it and, you know, giving it a good go. If you're in a position where you can dive into it and kind of know that you've got like some kind of like backup, maybe not like actually direct, like specifically like literally a job backup, but like a backup of sort of, you know, what you're currently doing, is that all right, kind of thing. But I think that, you know, as long as you're sort of comfortable not knowing and diving in and being unsure, then it's definitely worth giving it a go. I mean, really, that's kind of broad career advice. Like if you've got, I think it's really important to always be comfortable in like being uncomfortable, I guess, and sort of just giving it a go. But yeah, I don't really know if that was a very good answer to that question, but
I think it was, and I think at least you agreed. So yeah, I think that's all good. And keep the questions coming too. I know Bella may be like, "Oh, not more questions," but I'll be sure they're asked. So
no, it's fine. But you'll just have to dive back in and ask them, because I'm not very good at keeping up with the chat and giving the presentation at
that's
the
when
same time.
You don't have to worry about the chat. I'll keep my eye on the chat. You keep going with the presentation.
Awesome, thanks. Cool. So this is sort of things that are a little bit more aligned to actual coding in itself. So I think I mentioned before, so I spent about 6 months being the only person who was working on our back end for Tenancy 360. And, you know, I mean, I had a great time and I coded loads and I learned loads. And then we had somebody else join the team, and suddenly I had to explain all of the stuff that I had just sort of kept in my brain, because I was the only one that was looking at it. And so I kind of think that is probably similar in a way to people who are learning how to code outside of a job and doing courses on their own and working on code like by themselves. And then so I wanted to kind of share the ways in which like coding with other people has kind of changed. And I think this is also probably stuff that's kind of relevant to the hackathon, because you'll be coding with other people. So commit messages, so the link here is, which I feel like I can probably copy into the chat, but I might do that at the end, or because I don't want to undo this presentation. But this is a blog written by one of my colleagues about commit messages and when to do them, when not to do them, and sort of the best ways. And I think it's a pretty good blog post that I would like recommend people checking out. But sort of to kind of summarize, sort of it's good to make sure that your commit messages are sort of concise but informative. And sometimes actually elaborating makes them, you know, it isn't a bad thing to like write a really long commit message breaking down what you've done. It's kind of funny because for, you know, anyone who does, you know, commit messages on like Visual Studio, like on the top at the like there's like a little box to put your commit message in, and it's so small and it makes you think that your commit message needs to be like one sentence. And often my commit messages are one sentence, but then I think how often really would it be valuable to maybe make them a bit longer and elaborate more on what I've done in this commit and break it down a little bit more. And then also following on to that, how can I actually break down the commits that I'm making? If I've got like a big task that was going to like take me a day and I spend all day working on it and then just do like one big commit at the end, were there actually sort of checkpoints which could, oh, I've seen that Alex has posted the link. Thank you so much. You must have literally just typed that out. That's great. Yeah, so how can you sort of like checkpoint what you've done? So like if you go back to look at it or somebody else goes back to look at it, then, you know, it's less of just, I added this feature all in one go. You know, maybe there was like, you know, different elements to the feature. Like, you know, I added the function to send an email and then I implemented it here and here, or something like that. I mean, like I said, like a lot of this is like also things that I need to do myself. Like I'm definitely guilty of my commit messages deteriorating if I'm getting like frustrated with the task. Like I'll find myself just like my commit message is just like, I really hope that this fix works, send. And it's like, well, that's kind of, you know, a nice event at the time, but in the actual sort of coming back to what did I do in this commit is then less helpful. And as our team is expanding, it's becoming like really, you know, more obvious that we need to sort of be like documenting like what we're doing more in order to, you know, when we go back and look if anything's gone wrong or like what somebody did previously is a bit more obvious. Coding principles, this is again another one for myself as much as for any of you guys. So I've got a couple here. If anyone knows what they are, feel free to put it in the chat in the next sort of 30 seconds. But some of them are sort of some nice little sort of acronyms to kind of keep in your mind, and then others are sort of more like solid. I'm not even gonna try and go through all of the principles of solid right now. I think I've got a link to an article at the end that I thought did a pretty good job of like coming up with sort of analogies for each of the points. But it's for object-oriented programming, and it's kind of something that you sort of need to keep referring back to, and you will keep kind of improving your code with it. But some of the other two, so dry is just don't repeat yourself, which is like a pretty simple kind of coding concept of like, don't, you know, if something can be a function that you can reuse loads of times, then do that, like reuse code like as sort of functions or objects or classes rather than like typing out that literal code like over and over again. And then I just mentioned it in one of my answers to the questions, but Yagni is you aren't going to need it. So it's that idea of don't code things because you think that there's going to be a use for them in the future. Like do what you need to do just now. And yeah, so those are definitely like some helpful. I mean, I'm sure there's loads more different like little acronym ones that are sort of useful to like keep in your head. And then formatting and linting. This is probably actually something that's quite good for the hackathon, is to spend a little bit of time at the beginning once you've like worked out sort of, you know, what language you're going to code in or whatever you've got a project set up, just making sure that like your formatting and linting configurations are all the same, so that when you go off and code individually and then come back, there'll be a lot less noise in differences in your code that are actually just formatting. An example of this here is, I don't know how well you can see that, but you can see that there are differences in, you know, in the code. You've got like highlighted in red, highlighted in green. But if you actually have a look at all of those differences, the actual difference in the code is that there isn't any, like it's just formatting. It's just where the sort of spaces are, where the tabs are. And so if you've got all of that noise in like a git diff, as well as the noise of like, well, that's the noise, and then you actually care about what the actual changes to the code were, it can sort of be so time consuming to like go through that and be like, what's actually different. So it's kind of one of those things where it kind of seems not that important to sort of necessarily care so much about like where your tabs are and where your spaces are, but then it actually kind of saves you some time in the long run. And then equally sort of kind of leading on to that, merge conflicts. If you're someone who's sort of coding like primarily has, you know, been learning how to code like by yourself, your merge conflicts are really easy to work out if you're the person who wrote both sides of the conflict. So kind of getting good at when you've got conflicts, like, you know, working out where each thing came from, which bit's relevant now, knowing when you need to ask the person who wrote the other side of the conflict to kind of, you know, help you figure it out. Again, it's just one of these skills that like you sort of learn by doing and by like practicing it and by putting yourself in that situation, like in a hackathon where you're coding with other people, in order to sort of get good at these skills. You know, perhaps you're doing it like before you actually go into a job, and sort of, you know, if you've kind of done these things, if you're doing hackathons and stuff, and then you can talk about in interviews kind of the things that are sort of really good comparisons to what it's actually like sort of working in tech teams. And developing code review skills early. This is something that I wish I had started really thinking about earlier. I think there's this kind of idea of you have to sort of reach a certain point of seniority to be able to sort of review code, and there is sort of, to an extent, that is true, like to accept the responsibility of like what that code is, and to review it and to say that it's okay means that it's kind of on you. But the actual skill of like reading code, I think, is something that you should be developing alongside of your skill of like writing code, and I think they do feed into each other. And so like reviewing code, like reviewing other people's code in your team, you know, if that's possible, if that's something that you can kind of ask to sort of have some time to do, even if you're not the one that in the end that's going, yes, I approve, I think that's right, is so helpful to then when you kind of get to, you have to be the one that's code reviewing. You're kind of already comfortable in like spending time sitting and reading code, and not writing any of it. Are there any sort of questions?
There was just one around where you keep and save code.
Okay, so we use Git and GitLab to save all of our code. So obviously, like people use sort of GitHub as well, and yeah, it's just a lot of, again, if you don't know Git, learn Git as well. That's also a really good one to say you sort of got under your belt, if you want to sort of get into tech.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Cool. So I'm going to sort of like swerve away from the kind of technical side of things now, and more into sort of my experience, I guess, as a woman in tech. So I kind of want to talk about sort of navigating a male-dominated industry, a male-dominated sort of work environment. And one of the reasons I sort of wanted to mention this is because I remember when I was at uni, I went to this Women in Finance event, and it was like a networking event. And there were all these women who said all of these like amazing things about like what they'd achieved and what they'd done, but like nobody mentioned that they worked in like a historically male-dominated industry, like in finance. It just wasn't mentioned, which I kind of found really strange, because it was specifically like a Women in Finance event. And I mean, I don't know if like, it wasn't that long ago, I don't know if sort of like the conversation has changed a little bit and people are being more transparent about their experiences, but that's something that I've really enjoyed this week listening. I've listened to all of the other talks and people sort of, you know, speaking about it more, just like conversationally about what it's like to be in male-dominated industries. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about my experience, because the reality of the situation is that sometimes it can be quite discouraging, even if you're surrounded by like the nicest men in the world, to be, you know, the only person of, you know, whatever kind of group you are that isn't in the majority. I mean, it's kind of funny really when you think of it in terms of, you know, being female like isn't a minority. There's, you know, 51% on the planet or whatever. So I think that it's kind of interesting then how in the workplace it kind of feels so different, because if you are in a situation where you're in an industry, maybe even not in your company, but sort of in the wider kind of sphere of tech, is obviously quite male dominated. And one of the sort of lessons I learned, and it kind of links into what Rita was saying about authenticity, is when I started my secondment and I was working with a more senior software engineer, it was all remote. And the way that he messaged and the way that he spoke was always like really, really direct. And I was always someone who was like so conscious of like how I was coming across every time I messaged, and smiley faces and emojis and all of the pleasantries and stuff. And I thought, okay, well, why don't I just scrap all that? Why don't I just try and message in that way, be direct, like sort of care less about what everybody else thinks kind of stuff. And in a way it was kind of beneficial, but it was almost like I kind of went too far, and I found myself not just in that but in other ways kind of just sort of molding myself into all of into sort of the men I saw around me, and when really there were benefits from sort of being less apologetic in my messages, but actually what worked was taking the bits sort of that did work and leaving the rest. So like taking the bit of like, right, okay, my messages, I'm not going to sort of say sorry before everything or be like, oh, I think maybe it's this, when actually I know that it's definitely this. I'm actually going to try and, you know, be sort of more assertive and more direct. But also at the same time, I do like, you know, to send nice messages and use emojis and smiley faces, and that's fine. That's not making me like unfeminist because I want to do that. So I can just do that. And I would say something I've also found helpful, like quite recently, is like reaching out to sort of the women that aren't in my team necessarily, but are in the company. And because one, that's actually really good. It's really good to make connections with people outside of your team in a company and to network within your company. Because especially sort of, you know, Account Technologies is a company that loves collaboration throughout departments, and that's something that's really valued. And so, you know, making those connections with people is always really valuable. And then also, you know, you kind of end up, you know, finding sort of people that you can kind of connect with outside of your department who are sort of doing similar things to you, but maybe not in your exact same role. And then that in itself can sort of be really kind of encouraging. And I think as well, there's a difference between, you know, an environment that's really male dominated and sort of doesn't care, and one that kind of knows that there's a problem and wants to change. And I think that's sort of hopefully something that a lot of companies can kind of adopt, of like the culture of how they're sort of like looking to improve in their inclusion and, you know, in a multitude of departments, you know, diversity sort of across the spectrum, but then also in industries that are known to be, you know, specifically like male dominated. And this kind of brings me on sort of my next point. Oh, I didn't even show my nice picture, from She's the Man, which is kind of a nod to kind of pretending that you're someone that you're not, and you shouldn't do that. But anyway, sometimes silly to keep talking about it, but I'm kind of hoping that I will say some things that are somewhat nuanced. So we all know what it is, but, you know, what about like why it is? So I think specifically, I think, you know, lots of people, regardless of sort of who they are, suffer from imposter syndrome. But even then, we say suffer from imposter syndrome as if we're kind of pathologizing this kind of seeing it as like a problem that's within us that we sort of need to fix. But how can external factors sort of lead into that? Because I think that a lot of people will attest that, you know, that feeling of being sort of, you know, a fraud can be so exaggerated when you also can't see yourself and the others around you. Like, of course you would feel like an imposter if nobody around you is like, you know, the same gender or has, you know, also a part of the LGBTQ plus community or the same race. You know, of course you're going to feel like an outsider, and, you know, that can sort of lead into you know, feeling like an imposter and having all of that self-doubt. So, you know, it's that kind of that question of like, is it only coming from within ourselves? And a lot of the focus, like if you Google imposter syndrome, all of the things that come up are like, you know, how can I combat my imposter syndrome? Like, what can I do to stop feeling this way? And it's kind of interesting that there isn't that much out there on how actually workplaces can maybe combat like the sort of the issues of inclusivity or the environment that's like kind of creating this imposter syndrome. So I'm sort of like posing the question really of like, could like, you know, addressing the impact of workplace culture more kind of help to sort of foster this an environment that actually alleviates imposter syndrome, and maybe doesn't necessarily, you know, see it as just like a you problem. And so I kind of want to, in kind of talking about how you can help your own imposter syndrome, really talk about reframing it. So for example, you know, you've got an internal critique that's, you know, maybe telling you that you're rubbish all the time. But is that like necessarily, if you didn't have that internal critique, like you probably wouldn't care. Like it's because you don't care. Like if you've got that bit in your brain that's saying, oh, you know, how could I do that better? How could I do that better? Instead of beating yourself up about it, you know, use that as a drive for, you know, continuing to improve, continuing to develop. See it as reframing things like as a positive, because it's pretty normal to have a certain level of like of self-doubt. I think actually self-doubt's the next one. Yeah, like, you know, having self-doubt there for a reason. Like we have self-doubt because we should, you know, if you think about it in the context of nature and being, you know, like cavemen, if you back every single sort of thought that pops into your head and just go for it, you don't know, probably end up like eaten by a lion or like set on fire or something. So there's not like having a bit of self-doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, being confident doesn't mean that you're, you know, competent or you've got like a higher ability. Sometimes you can, you know, people can be overconfident. I'm sure, like, you know, we all have seen people before who, you know, they have all of this like confidence and bravado, but like what is it actually like backed up with? And so it's not necessarily like a bad thing to have all of these kind of feelings that we associate with imposter syndrome. It's more about kind of, I think, the way that they're framed, both like internally, like within yourself, and then also kind of like externally, like our approach to imposter syndrome. Okay, I think this is pretty much my final slide. It's just like a little bit on recruitment. So devs are in demand. It's no secret. There are so many tech roles and not enough people to fill them. So really, it's kind of a great time to just give it a go, because it's not really about like how you worry if it's the right fit for you and let them worry about if you're the right fit for the company is, you know, so true. Like, especially at the moment, if people are looking for jobs, if companies are looking for tech jobs, for people for tech jobs, and they're not finding the people with their exact sort of specification, then they're going to need to change their, you know, their job description, or they're going to need to maybe lower their expectations and train people up. And I think where we're seeing this high demand for people in tech and for senior people in tech that literally just do not exist, I think sort of the hope, and I think kind of the sort of future intention, I know with Account Technologies is, you know, how can we go about you know, people creating maybe jobs that are more than that, where you have more senior people at your disposal in the end. But obviously, you know, it's weighing that up with the, well, if we need, you know, we need people now, we, you know, versus we're going to invest in people to sort of like have in, you know, a couple of years. But hopefully, I think, you know, I'm not the only person in the company who's sort of done a similar thing where they've started as an analyst and then gone into tech. They've got a few people who have started in, you know, roles in one department and have, you know, gone down a more technical route. And I hope that that is something that is sort of like continually fostered. But I think something to sort of look at now when you're looking for roles is like how long senior developers have been in the company. Like, are there people there to do the training? And you know, there is obviously, you know, there is a balance between having the ability to learn as you go and also, you know, having somebody to kind of ask questions to. Where New Ventures sits in Account Technologies is quite nice, because I've been able to could talk to sort of the more senior people in the core team, although they're not necessarily always directly working on what I'm working on or on our product. It's nice to like have someone to go to if I'm feeling like, oh, I really don't understand, to have like a person to like go to. So it's really important to a thing to think about, because I think a lot of tech culture is that there's quite like a high turnaround. People are like looking at you know, a lot of software developers are like contractors and they're going from like role to role. So for me anyway, I think a priority is like, you know, making sure there's people there that can sort of help in the company. And then I was just the thing to talk about recruiters, because I get so many messages from recruiters, I think because I literally have that I'm in a tech job on my LinkedIn, and there are recruiters everywhere. I remember when I was like getting a job, looking for jobs as a graduate, there's so many recruiters, and every recruiter kind of has their different style. And I do think that it is important to shop for recruiters and make sure that, you know, their approach to a job hunt matches yours, because, you know, some people, you know, some recruiters will sort of, you know, bombard you with loads of opportunities. Others will be sort of more careful about like each individual opportunity and stuff. And you kind of got to find someone that sort of like works like in the same way that you do, I think, when you're looking for a job. And then sort of a final thing is asking about the demographic of a department or of a company when you're in an interview. And if it doesn't meet your expectations, asking what they're doing to improve, because I do think that, you know, you're not necessarily going to get like perfection. You know, every company that you interview for isn't necessarily going to be like, yeah, we have like all of these like, you know, inclusive groups and blah blah blah, and you know, it's like really 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 diverse. But you know, if a company does go like, oh yeah, so this is our current demographic, like we're trying to improve here, here and here, then that's so much more positive, and that's kind of the direction that we sort of need to be going in, and it's different to a company that, you know, hasn't really given it any kind of thought. And yeah, and I think that's pretty much it. I think my last slide is just a few links, which I can maybe try and copy and paste in. I'm sure Alex can figure out how to like copy and paste into the channel. The first is just LinkedIn if anyone wants to connect, and the links to the Account Technologies careers page, and the recruitment email. Like if you're interested in tech and you kind of want to you know, ping your CV over to us, like that is a totally fine thing to do. Probably for most companies is a totally fine thing to do, and like would encourage. And then also just a few interesting reading links and things that sort of inspired me for this talk, and just some things that I think are quite interesting if anyone wants to check them out. I don't know if there were any more questions again. Oh, and Alex is back. Hello.
I am back. Trying to send links and do all sorts. But no, a huge thank you for coming here and giving up your time to get involved. I think it's, I mean, I usually kind of say I've found it, you know, very inspiring, which I haven't. I usually say I hope the audience have too, but I can tell from the chat that they very much have. So yeah, a big thank you for getting involved. There are a couple more questions, and again, you know, keep them coming while we answer as well. But kind of talking around the point of inclusivity, there was a question asked around what's it kind of like, I guess, account technologies, you know, from a women in tech perspective. I guess I would kind of caveat that with, you know, it's great that they're supporting events like this, you know, not to kind of toot our own horn with Athena and what it's about, but obviously kind of supporting and getting involved in women in tech events. It's not the whole solution. It's not the whole thing, obviously, but I guess that's kind of a stepping stone, and kind of shows what they're about a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that this is a really good sort of stepping stone for us. And I think that across our sort of like analytics department and tech department, there's definitely more men than women. You know, there's no point pretending that there isn't. And I think that at the moment, like the focus is on like what can we do to kind of improve on that. And you know, it doesn't come just from me. Like I don't have the power to sponsor this event. It's coming from sort of, you know, the more senior people, which is a really good thing, that it's kind of, that's sort of where it's kind of coming from, and we're kind of recognizing that we've got a demand, you know, for people in tech. We want to be hiring more people, and how can we sort of invest in people and you know, create opportunities that are maybe at a less senior level in order to get people into tech, because from a sort of, you know, bigger picture kind of view of it, it's there's so many people in tech are in demand, and if the people, you know, if people aren't coming fresh out of uni ready to go into tech, then how are we going to, you know, improve that? How are we going to, you know, from a perspective, you know, that's almost kind of independent of diversity, but also very much linked to it, because at the end of the day, if you're maybe cutting out that barrier of like, right, we need people who are you know, at a certain technical level straight out of uni, you kind of broaden the scope of people that you can interview. Like, you know, there are people, loads of people get into tech who aren't necessarily, didn't do like computer science or even maths at uni. And actually one of the links that that I've added, which I'll try and copy and paste now, is a link on how like your aptitude for language is actually linked to your ability to like learn how to code. And so kind of this interesting idea that actually, you know, if coding is a language and you're good at languages, then maybe that's actually something that's sort of you can get into. Maybe you did Spanish at uni and now you can do like go into coding. So I think opening up that opportunity, like hopefully then as sort of like a direct result of that will kind of help to diversify. By diversifying opportunity will then sort of diversify the intake that sort of we get into our company, is kind of the hope.
I think that's a very good answer. I think the point you make around language is really interesting. And I think kind of more and more organizations are realizing the scope of talent and, you know, kind of widening the talent pool. I think a couple of questions were around, you know, how many of your colleagues weren't at university, you know, what's the kind of process like for career changes, etc. I think I kind of just build on that and say, you know, tech is becoming one of the leading industries, and you know, it's getting there. It's not necessarily there yet, but it's getting there. Like one of the leading industries in terms of, you know, realizing how much is self-taught, and kind of there was a Stack Overflow report that kind of like I think it was from as long as 2016, but like it's still kind of thrown around today. You know, 2/3 of devs are self-taught, or some of the languages they use are self-taught. So you know, you kind of progress so quickly, and languages that you may have learned in uni 5 years ago are no longer relevant. So there's kind of so much scope for learning and growth, and as you say, whether it's like a completely different subject and you switch because you still have aptitude, or whether it's kind of you've done a boot camp or whatever it may be, I think there's definitely it's definitely kind of moving in the right direction. Which I guess I've just seen a question from Yash as well, which hopefully that sort of answers that around a degree isn't necessarily it doesn't hurt, you know. I guess Isabella, I don't know if you kind of have experience with like how many of your colleagues do or don't have degrees, or what you've seen in the past. I guess there are certain industries and vacancies that like are for graduates and are graduate specific, and that will be the case for a while. But apprenticeships, for example, are kind of on the rise, and boot camps are on the rise, and career changes are on the rise. So yeah, I guess it's something that's changing, but I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I don't think like I've seen it sort of greatly kind of like myself, but I think that for sure there definitely is kind of this drive, and I do think that where we're going with all of these tech like jobs cropping up and not people to fill them, and that kind of idea of like lowering the bar, you know, maybe because it should be lowered, maybe because having a degree isn't necessarily, you know, indicative of being able to go into a job in tech, or, you know, going into other jobs as well, but sort of specifically talking about tech. I mean, I do know that we do have like a few people within our company who have kind of climbed up from like all different sort of departments. Like we have a call center. We often have people who come over from the call center into our back office and then end up, you know, as analysts or in more sort of technical roles and developing their skills. And so I think that that's something that the company does like to foster sort of within the company, is kind of, you know, getting into you know, once you're in, like, kind of where can you find like your sort of path, which sort of I've seen other people do, and sort of, you know, I kind of did myself. I started like on the sort of graduate analyst program, and then have ended up in like a completely different department doing something completely different that like I never really thought that I was going to do, because the opportunity was there and I sort of, you know, yeah, okay, I thought, yeah, okay, I'll go for it, but also because that opportunity was created and I was like, oh, that sounds fun, let's do that. So I do think that is something that sort of like, yeah, we try and foster, and I think that the sort of industry and the climate is going to have to foster.
Amazing. I think unfortunately we've kind of met the hour and we are out of time with this one. I was going to say, hopefully it's gone as quickly for you as it has for me, because it's flown by. But
yeah, it has flown by.
Good. And a big thank you again for kind of giving up your time and getting involved. Really appreciate it. It was super insightful. I think if anyone's got any questions, kind of we'll post this on our YouTube. So whether you're watching retrospectively or whether there was just stuff that didn't get answered, feel free to, you know, pop up on Discord, ping me an email. Obviously, Bella put her kind of LinkedIn in the chat and on the slide. So again, connect with her. Not that I want people to necessarily spam you with questions, Bella, but I think we're kind of.
I mean, I can talk about all of this all day.
Exactly. That's the thing. So yeah, a huge thank you to everyone for joining. A huge thank you to you, Bella, for getting involved, and good luck with the hack, everyone. Not long to go now.